art and nonsense. Uglow's latest book, Sybil and Cyril, Cutting Through the Time, appeared in 2021. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comment section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, Inventory of a Life Mislaid, an Unreliable Memoir, Marina Warner in conversation with Jenny Uglow. Over to you, Jenny.
Marina, when you said, "Here I am," it's very poignant because I feel that you're in the book too. But why did you choose this quote?
Well, I began to feel very haunted as I explored my parents' lives and returned to my childhood. The book really ends when I'm 6, not even 6. So I had to reconstruct and think through and imagine very intensely what it was like. And that brought them very close. And the Shabti figure is something that you see a lot in Egyptian collections in museums. These were little figures who were put in the tomb to do the work for the dead so that they would have a nice time in the afterlife. And I identified very, very strongly with this figure of the answerer, the person who comes when you call and does things. I felt but I enjoyed it. It was painful, but I kind of enjoyed doing this work for my parents. It was harvesting. And I think also the idea of ferrying the past into the present, keeping the past alive, and also bringing places that I haven't been to and have totally changed, bringing them into some kind of reality again now.
And you do feel their presence because you did find some material, didn't you, to look at, like this is a wonderful letter from your father when he's at school.
Yes, so he says, please send some jam.
Yeah.
So everything's spelt wrong. Yes, it's very, and actually it was very touching to read these materials. And I inherited, my mother had a garage and she'd stopped driving a long time before she died, and she kept absolutely everything. She'd been born, in 1922, the fascist years in Italy, the war. She was so thrifty. She would pull the thread out of old clothes and wind it around a piece of paper to be able to use it again. And so she had kept everything. And as a result, sorry?
No, she was obviously very determined to keep records of what she was doing too.
Yes, exactly. And so I found, which I hadn't known, she'd kept reading notes all her life. So this is from 1950 in Cairo, and she's reading Somerset Maugham, and she read a lot of Monica Dickens. It gave a portrait of a social milieu, but also of aspirations and hopes. And in the case of my father, that was a letter from his boarding school when he was 7. And that kind of separation and that way that the English public school system deliberately sets out to stamp out emotion, to not let people make sentimental attachments, and unfortunately stunts them. That was definitely my father's fate.
And I think that you look at things too. The book is an inventory, and these are remarkable, like your mother's engagement rings, which was sent from England, and then also this amazing little container of film.
Yes, this was inside a cigarette box, and I opened it, and inside I found 2 negative coils of film, one wrapped around the other. It was a moment of really intense epiphany, an example of how the genie really comes out of the lamp with certain objects. They really contain inside them, such a kind of compressed and absolutely passionate history. So these 2 coils of film, the first was of my mother on their honeymoon in 1944, looking like a young, very, very young, beautiful Italian girl. And the second was the film showing Cairo burning in 1952, which was really the other kind of fulcrum of my father's life. One positive, but in the end, eventually dashed. The other, the disaster, when his bookshop, which he had started just after the war, was actually set fire to in the nationalist uprising of 1952 in Cairo, which led to Suez 4 years later, and eventually led to the dissolution of the relationship between Britain and Egypt.
And these meetings of your parents and then the fire in Cairo are like sort of bookends to the book, aren't they? But their actual backgrounds were so different. It's extraordinary that they came together. This is where your grandfather, a great and famous cricketer, comes from the West Indies, and there is your father with Marina Warner, who I think gets called Plum. And it sort of sums up exactly what you were saying, really, about this English background. And yet it has a colonial tinge as well.
Yes, I mean, my grandfather was born in Trinidad and was one of a long line of many generations of Warners who had been in the West Indies, all over the West Indies, in fact. And I hadn't really known this history until I was grown up, when I began investigating it, and I've written about it in other places. But I think that was very key to my father's character. Plum Warner was very attached to Trinidad, and he actually did integrate the team, which is a feather in his cap. I mean, the Warner history in the West Indies is not an honorable one, but in this case, this was a good thing that he did. But you can see also the emotional alienation, I think, in this photograph very clearly. You know, there is a little boy in a three-piece suit, sort of tweed, and there is the father, actually sort of still dressed as almost a boy.
Yes, yes, yes.
So they're sort of reversed. I mean, they should be, you know, yes. And then and clothes, in the inventory, clothes figure quite a lot, as well as the other objects. And because clothes, as everybody has experienced, especially when somebody dies, carry the scent of them, the being of them. They're haunted by the ghosts. And this was a pair of shoes that my father had made for my mother, especially made by a cobbler. And she always called them brogues, but they seemed to me to be the equivalent of the glass slipper. This was the shoe that she should fit to be an Englishwoman. This was the country shoe that she would go for country walks. She would, you know, go riding to hounds. I mean, she'd follow the hounds or something with these shoes. Yeah. And it was so alien to the way she was brought up. I mean, it would have been sort of ribbon espadrilles in her part of southern Italy. Yeah. Or pumps.
It's very haunting. The actual shape of the feet still you can see in the shoe. And this is a tremendously sensual book, Marina. It tastes and smells like the fiery gentleman's relish that your father liked, but also that feeling of the clothes, of the textures and things. I think it's completely wonderful about this. And
well, thank you.
Also think, how did she fit into London society? There's this great photograph of her with her sisters, and then suddenly here she is outside Buckingham Palace going to a garden party, not wearing her.
Yes. Well, she was in some ways, she was a very good chameleon. You know, she learned to speak English very, very well. She learned all kinds of English customs and manners, and in some senses, even intensified them. I mean, she became, she became every inch an English lady, which was, except that, as I said in my chapter on brogues, that she kept what you might call a brogue in English. She had a kind of lilt, an Italian lilt. I could no longer hear it because her voice was so familiar to me, but friends told me that she did sound Italian, but she didn't sound caricature Italian at all, because her English was very good. And she wanted, I mean, I think this is an interesting aspect of female history, which has not perhaps been explored as much as it could be, which is that we now have social mobility in our own right. But for my mother's generation, social mobility came through other things, particularly marriage, particularly men. And she had wanted that social mobility. She wanted to change. Italy was not a happy place when she was growing up. Even the church was tremendously corrupt and in cahoots with the fascist police and so forth. So she was pleased to leave Italy, but she also wanted to make her way and to shine, and she was rather glamorous, as you can see, and she wanted to shine in the correct way. So she became quite conventional, in spite of having a streak of independent-mindedness and a certain brilliance, actually.
I think that the whole sort of life, the darkness and dullness also of English life wasn't quite for her. She looked wonderful with her hat and her bag. You know, she's very carefully thinking how she will appear. But then, of course, they did leave England and go to Cairo, where your father started this W.H. Smith, and that's quite a story in itself.
Yes. Well, actually, the winter that I was born, 1946 to 7, was the coldest on record. My mother had never left southern Italy before. There was no fresh food, very, very little, dreadful rationing, incredible lack of opportunity. Thousands and thousands and thousands of men had returned, and women, servicemen had returned, no work. And my father hunted about for an idea, and it's a typically British story of class connections, which unfortunately still goes on, in which he knew some people who owned W.H. Smith. And he sort of said, well, what about, would you be in somewhere warm? And at first they thought of Jerusalem. And then they thought Cairo. Then my father insisted Cairo, because he'd been there in the war and he knew that it was a great metropolis with a lot of cosmopolitan readers. So believe it or not, W.H. Smith agreed, and it was quite an operation. I mean, they had a big staff and 2 premises, and it was an expensive operation. It went quite well to begin with.
I know, it looks wonderfully well stocked, and obviously here is a staff outing, which is rather splendid. And you see
Yes. Yeah.
But fun, it looks like to me.
Yes, well, you can see there also the staff was, the Egyptians had rightly passed a law that Arabic should be used as a second language in foreign firms, and also that there should therefore be lots of Arabic speaking staff. And you can see that it was a staff that represented the locals as well.
Your own life, or where you lived, seems slightly cut off from Egyptian life. There's a lovely picture of Solomon House, and I think you were right on the top floor.
Yes, we were, with balconies on both sides. This side, the rear balcony, looked over Gazera Sporting Club, which had been a huge park with polo fields and racetrack and every kind of amenities, swimming pools for children, swimming pools for adults, and had been closed to Egyptians until a certain point. But now, when we were there, Egyptians were allowed into this immense park in the middle of Cairo. And we looked over that on that side. And on the other side, we looked over the Nile. So the front of the house and we were on that, as you say, in that penthouse. So it wasn't exactly cut off from Egyptians. I've met several Egyptians since who actually also lived at that apartment block or other apartment blocks on that same island, Gazera, in the middle of Zamalek, in the middle of Cairo. But it was, of course, an extremely privileged and very colonial life that we led, I'm afraid.
And rather cosmopolitan and smart.
Well, yes, it was a tremendous hedonistic. They'd never run out of anything during the war. There'd been champagne then and fine wines and parties and gambling. And I mean, in some ways, alluring and exciting place, lots of culture, but also very decadent and heedless. I mean, they were partying. It was partying before the revolution, again, as often happened in history.
And at this point, your own memories begin to come in with your mother. I think that's when you had explain how you got a shaven head.
Yes, that's right. Because I had head lice, and one of my earliest memories is actually having my head shaved and being so terrified of the razor. I was a very pampered child, as you can see, and my mother, who's a marvelous dressmaker, all the clothes you've seen her wear, she made herself, made me all these very pretty frocks, which I'm afraid I don't think quite suited me. I learned to be very feminine. And I loved my dolls.
Yes, you loved your dolls, and they're so admiring of your mother in that picture. It's touching.
Yes.
But here you are. You probably spent more time with the other people in your house than you did with your parents.
Yes, Abdul and Mohammed were great friends of both myself and my sister Laura, who you see there, very tiny. And a lot of my early memories are of being in the kitchen with them, and also with my nannies. I had various nannies. My parents, my earliest memory of my mother is her clinking with her jewelry as she came in to say goodbye to me before they went out, and her delicious scent. She smelled delicious, and her rustling of her clothes, and her. But she was rather, in some ways, not a very close figure. I mean, she was very, and the kind of intimate life was very much with, you know, these our servants, as it were. I tell a few stories. The book is structured in sort of some live memories that I have, which are not very many, lantern slides from before I was 6. And then I try to the reality of the objects and what they connected to. And then there are sort of digressions into other associated streams of consciousness. Because this is the third nanny we had. In between, we had a white nanny, and I didn't like her. And I was such a spoiled child that I asked for my other nanny back, but I don't think she came back. I think that this was the replacement.
This is a juxtaposition of, as it were, the photos from these albums and from the container, I think, with, as you say, the way that it fits into different contexts, wider, these excursions. And there are a series of discussions in the book, one of which is about the artist David Wilkie, who was in Constantinople in the 1840s. But this particular picture of the little girl, I thought that you identified with, but I think you said you wanted to actually be her in this Wilkie.
Yes, I wanted to be her. I didn't think I was like her at all. I thought I felt like a changeling with my shaven head and my sort of chubbiness, and my pretty clumsy I was too. But anyway, I thought this was a very, you know, beautiful little expensively wrapped doll, and that was, we have this picture. I still have the picture, and we had it in the flat in Cairo, and I very much wanted to be her, and I thought she was a local. I thought she was. I thought she was sort of like an Egyptian princess, and I wanted to be an Egyptian princess. But when I began writing the book, and looking much more carefully at the picture, I saw it said daughter of Admiral Walker, and then I noticed, of course, that she's got blue eyes and this kind of China doll complexion. And I realized that, you know, I'd made a mistake, but the mistake was very interesting because it showed that this idea of wishing to be exotic and somehow other was actually already happening long before. I mean, I in that state was actually just the inheritor of a long cultural complex of the British, which is both this strange desire to subdue and subjugate, but also, not strange desire, but this sort of very unfortunately human desire to do that, but at the same time to kind of be these, to be as exciting and, you know, gifted and gorgeous as these objects. And then Wake Walker turned out to be an absolute character straight out of Hornblower.
Yeah, yes, and it is what you say when you talk about your life or your experience in relation to the discussions of what we call Orientalism, but you also talk about ornamentalism, this whole desire to dress up. And there are a wonderful Wilkie, here's Wilkie himself looking good,
romantic,
British, and his famous painting of Waterloo. So it's a very sort of, or the news coming of Waterloo, which is very British and celebratory of British military achievement.
Well, I think I think he was a very conflicted character. And he did record British achievements and Wake Walkers and the King here, George IV. But actually, if you go back to the Waterloo Dispatch, that painting, if you go back to it, Jenny, please, go back one if you can. You can see that he actually knew that these wars cost people a lot. I mean, that there was a huge amount of distress and agony around it. And he also has, right in the middle of the painting, there is a black figure, and all these figures have been actually identified since then. And this is a bandsman from a band, a military band. But you can also, there's a woman with a baby, and you can see her anxiety. So he he became very depressed, and the travels to the Holy Land and to the East and to Constantinople were actually prescribed by his doctor to ease his mental distress, and he died the year after. So he was a man of very mixed. He didn't feel entirely happy as an aristocratic painter or a celebrator of war.
So happier perhaps in Constantinople, making paintings of this kind with the
yes, and this connects with your other question about the fancy dress and the way that the gorgeousness of local costumes and ways of being so much appeal to the he was Scottish, in fact, to someone who'd been brought up in a poor farm perhaps not a farm, but anyway, he brought up in poverty in Scotland.
Yes, and I think too this idea of a strange sort of layering of cultures occurs quite often in the book, and I was struck at the point that your father discovers this old map of Cairo, or and the book about that. And I think, can you explain what this garden of material is?
Yes, well, these are details from a very large map, incredibly wonderfully detailed and captioned map of Cairo, made in Venice in the 16th century. And it says this one on the left is the garden where you can get the true balsam and where the Virgin Mary rested on the flight into Egypt. And the one on the right, which is very near it on the map, is the tree, Pharaoh's tree, which is very, very old, and where in the shade of which the Madonna often rested. So I got very, very interested that the flight into Egypt had become a reality that could be mapped into places in Cairo. And on a visit to Cairo in 2014, the writer Ada Suef very kindly took me to Matarea to see the shrine, which still exists. And there's still a tree, which I'll show you in a minute. But in the book, I arranged for the staff outing of the firm to go to see this place, and it's a kind of a moment of a connection between the Catholic past, which my mother was a Catholic, and the present reality of Egypt for her. But also it leads into a kind of whole meditation digression on the eroticism associated with the East, because where you can get the true balm is the special perfumed oil that Mary Magdalene takes to the tomb because she wants to embalm Jesus, that she had originally poured over Jesus's feet, dusty feet, and dried his feet with her hair with this special expensive ointment. And the people around had said, "How can she be she's such a sinner? How dare he let her touch him?" And then also they say, how could she should, her ill-gotten gains have paid for this wicked, expensive ointment, and she shouldn't just pour it on his feet. And Jesus, says, "For she has loved much, much shall be forgiven her." So she's the type of the fallen woman through sex, through beauty, through allure and charm, who somehow redeems herself. And I got interested in this, and I felt, that as a Catholic, I was brought up a Catholic, and my mother remained a Catholic, that she had a very strong sense of women as occasions of sin, the bodies of women being dangerous places of defilement, that all their charms are, diabolical arts that enchant men and lead them into perdition, and so forth. So I looked at a lot of images of Mary Magdalene, and I got very interested in the jar of the balm, and how it's portrayed. And it seemed to me that it was a metonymy for her body. It is the sort of sweetness of her body.
And it fits too with that luxury and sensuality that is found, as it were, in Egypt. And this one in particular, I think is a very splendid painting, in that she looks as if she knows just what that jar means.
I'm afraid so. That sort of slightly minx-like knowing look But I see the connection of the balm with sexuality became very clear in the Victorian age, when this cordial balm of Gilead was a best-selling medicine for curing the consumptive habit, and the consumptive habit is masturbation. So this seemed to me to be this sort of nexus of associations between the Orient.
Exactly, and it's extraordinary thing about what is sin, or what needs curing, you know, and that you should go back, as it were, to something so sexual to cure something else. It's fascinating and very redolent of the complexity and the sensual aspect of your book itself. And the fig tree, the sacred fig tree, is, I think, still there in the garden, or was meant.
Yes, it was. Well, in 2014, it was there. Yeah. In fact, that is quite a long time ago now, but so I think it's still there.
A place of coming and going, and still a place of pilgrimage. But if the fig tree is still there, the bookshop, alas, is not.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Because this is the photograph my father took from the balcony. But I have an early memory in the book of how he came back and he fell on the ground and he was crying. It's the first time I'd seen him actually convulsed with weeping. It was terribly frightening for a child. And my mother ran over to him, and it was, he could see that his sort of this work that he'd put in, that was beginning to be a great success, was actually just simply going up in smoke in front of his eyes.
And so it literally, I think, you feel that at this point in the book that life is in ashes, you know, that something, the whole era has ended, and of course it's a personal tragedy, and but it also a significant moment, I think, in history, the history of the British in the Middle East and in Egypt in particular.
Absolutely, and it also poses questions that are still extremely sharp now, because you'd think to burn down a bookshop is a desecration, is a terrible thing. It was burnt down alongside all the other British interests and some other foreign interests. For example, the Rolls-Royce showroom, Barclays Bank, the British Council, and so forth. So it was seen as part of soft power. I mean, it wasn't seen as an innocent cultural showcase. So and that question is still with us. I mean, we hear a lot now about soft power, and so I think I left the questions open, but I hope that I opened them in a kind of suggestive and moving way.
Yes, I think that you did, and we leave, as it were. You left Cairo, and your parents and your family came back to England. And then there's a long time and a long way before you begin to be able to explore and find it again. It must have been a difficult book to write in some ways.
It was actually at times shockingly painful, because I discovered so many things that I hadn't known in the letters and postcards. But it was also it was a very rewarding book to write. Emotionally very rewarding, and I'm very happy that my sister likes it, for example.
Well, thank you, Marina.
Well, thank you, Jenny, so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina and Jenny, for a riveting conversation, and thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us this series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. Sessions are ongoing across all 3 venues, Front Lawn, Mughal Tent, and Darbar Hall. Hope to see you in the next session.